I'm very emotionally charged and I'm angry, but I'll do my best to articulate myself clearly. And before we give a spotlight to Charlie Hebdo, let's take a moment to remember the victims. On the 6th of February of 2023, two devastatingly powerful earthquakes hit a region that borders northern Syria and southern Turkey. As a result, over 16,000 people have lost their lives in the carnage, with thousands more injured survivors. My thoughts are with everyone affected. I can only imagine a fraction of the immeasurable and irreversible damage that this has caused residents of that area and beyond. So I urge you to donate whatever you can to support the rescue and recovery organizations. I'll leave a link in the description that lists 19 ways you can help, so please pick any or several of them. On the very same day that the earthquakes hit Turkey and Syria, while tens of thousands of people were still shell-shocked and stuck under the rubble, the magazine posted this tone-deaf tweet with the caption, "Drawing of the Day." In the drawing itself, it says, "Earthquake in Turkey. No need to send tanks." This drawing is regarded by millions of people to be racist, Islamophobic, and a celebration of the loss of lives. I don't fully agree with that assessment, and I'll tell you why after I contextualize my exposure to this magazine. How do I know Charlie Hebdo? I only came across this drawing because of all the controversy surrounding it, which reminds me of the first time I ever heard of this magazine back in 2015. They had published a drawing of Prophet Muhammad, the most revered figure in Islam, which upset millions of Muslims around the world. When terrorists attacked the magazine's headquarters in retaliation, killing a dozen people, many outraged Muslims saw the attack as inevitable or even justified, and many non-Muslims were using the slogan "Je suis Charlie," meaning "I am Charlie," to show solidarity with the murdered employees and with the publication as a whole, and to reaffirm their right to free speech to publish the drawing even though many deemed it blasphemous. And because of the magazine's refusal to retreat even after the attack, it was heralded as a hero of free speech and an enemy of religious extremism, and an enemy of a lot of Muslims. Back then, I was a Muslim. I too was upset by the drawing of the Prophet, but I made sure to not look it up. I didn't see a point in viewing the image, talking about it, or demanding that they take it down. I thought that it doesn't hurt Allah or His Prophet in any way. At most, it would hurt my feelings, and the best course of action is to ignore it. But I despised how the terrorist attack polarized people even more. I was vocally in defense of Muslims and Islam, and I was so adamant that the terrorists who shouted Allahu Akbar had nothing at all to do with Islam. And even though I was unsettled by those who celebrated the violence and saw it as an equivalent to the drawing, I was reassured by many Muslims who thought that violence was not an answer. And of course, I didn't side with Charlie Hebdo. In fact, I didn't side with anyone. Taking sides can be far too simplistic sometimes. I wish the terrorist attack never happened, but I also wish that they never drew the Prophet. And after leaving Islam, I still did not say "Je suis Charlie." I did not want to align myself with a magazine without knowing their track record, their values, and their opinions on other topics. In fact, I don't see myself aligning strongly with any publication ever, because that leaves no room for nuance. It's impressive that the magazine did not succumb to threats, but that alone doesn't make them morally virtuous in any and all ventures. And I hope that clarifies how I feel about the magazine in general. So, what does it mean? Going back to this drawing, I invite you to see it with the eyes of someone who identifies with the victims. Imagine being Arab or Kurdish or even Muslim. You're shown this drawing by a news source or a person that you trust, and you're given the literal translation in your own language. "No need to send tanks!" Exclamation mark. And you're told that this is clear evidence of the pre-existing narrative that the French hate your kind so much that they'll laugh at your demise. They'll celebrate not having to waste taxpayer money on tanks. That's how insensitive they are. And if you doubt that a presumably popular magazine would say something so horrid, so hateful, so brazenly, you're shown that the drawing was indeed published by Charlie Hebdo, and the tweet is still up. That's a real tweet, it's not fake news. And that alone proves the rest of the narrative. I wouldn't blame you for coming to that conclusion, but I really don't think that was the point the artist abysmally tried to make. The magazine is known for taking an anti-war stance and does not support genocide, so it would make no sense for them to publish a drawing to convey that they value the cost of tanks more than human lives. Besides, France is not at war with Turkey, nor do the French wish Turkish people death, by tank or otherwise. There are other interpretations of the drawing that seem more plausible and align better with the pessimistic dark humor tone of the magazine. For example, when viewing it from a French-centric angle, some think that this is mocking the French government because they've been dragging their feet about sending tanks to aid Ukraine in fighting the Russian invasion. In other words, the artist is saying, these people need your help too, and you don't have to procrastinate with the excuse that sending tanks is logistically and geopolitically complicated. Another interpretation is that the drawing highlights the parallels between destruction from war and natural disaster, to point out that humans have caused just as much damage with tanks, so it's morbidly funny to see that tragedies of this scale are preventable if the warmongers stopped sending tanks. Some other interpretations are focused on Turkey, given credence by the artist's inclusion of the words earthquake in Turkey. The area most impacted by the earthquakes is home to a large population of Kurdish people, who are an ethnic minority in Turkey. The Turkish President Erdogan had been waging a war against them for many years now, so this may be a commentary on how his goals were aided by a natural disaster without the need for tanks. Further to the point, it might be a commentary on corruption in the Turkish government, and they're turning a blind eye to the poor building standards in the area that is prone to earthquakes, which results in more harm to the Kurds than they can do with tanks with less public outcry. But it shouldn't be my job to speculate and to explain to people why the artist didn't mean to come off as hateful. All these interpretations are not obvious, nor are they as easy to capitalize on as the shocking and belittling interpretation that this is a celebration of the death of people who would have otherwise died anyway, but at a greater inconvenience to the war machine. So I can't help but wonder if the people who greenlit this drawing are so inept, so incompetent at communicating their point that such a misunderstanding would be widely adopted, or if they were counting on the misunderstanding and the shock value of it, knowing how much of a noise this is bound to make. Either way, the onus falls on Charlie Hebdo to do better. This is not their first rodeo. I am aware that there can be merit to using shock value as a catalyst to spread a certain opinion or to invigorate a discussion with a new angle, or it can be used to highlight our hypocrisy and how selective we can be with outrage. But all these arguments dissolve when you notice the hastiness of the publication. They didn't carefully craft a caption. They didn't add explanatory context. They didn't even wait for the bodies to be found before rushing to make their supposedly enlightened commentary. They didn't add a call to action to use the commotion to direct more donations to the region. Given its timing and execution, this drawing, like many others, comes off as opportunistic, snotty, and insensitive. Whatever point they were trying to make is not worth their trivialization of the tragedy or all the harm that will come from using this drawing to further polarize the world. So let me take this opportunity to reassure you that people in France and the rest of the non-Arab, non-Muslim world are not celebrating these deaths. This is not a sentiment tolerated among Westerners, nor is it a consequence of the secular world. In fact, all of the humanitarian organizations that I linked in the description are secular, meaning separate from religion. And the fact that people in the West are repulsed by the hateful interpretation of this drawing is a sign that the public conscience is healthier than what the drawing could lead you to believe. And while there is truth in the narrative that many powerful nations benefit from prolonged destabilization of the Middle East or from war in general, please do not be misled by the controversy surrounding this drawing. This is not the public's opinion towards war and suffering. Governments do capitalize on war, most often without the people's consent, but that's not the same as entire nations and their populations being on board. And that is unfortunately the narrative that is now spreading like wildfire in the Muslim world, that disbelievers are laughing at their death, be it by earthquake or artillery. This narrative is so simplistic that it leads people to view themselves in discrete categories like Muslim or Kafir, East or West. And that's why the drawing is interpreted as pro-war and anti-Muslim, because despite it being French, it's part of the monolithic enemy Kafir. I expect this drawing to serve as propaganda for many years to come, as a depiction of what the kuffar think of Muslims. I expect that it will aid in radicalizing people when it's combined with religious or nationalistic pride. I expect that a lot of harm will come from this, and that's why I'm angry. Is this Islamophobic? Perhaps everything I said so far seems agreeable to you. This next part is where I might lose you, but I hope that you'll hear me out anyway. Is this drawing racist? Given the interpretations that align most with the magazine's tone, I don't think so. Can it be interpreted as a spiteful, supremacist, and racist joke at the expense of the victims? Well, given how poorly contextualized it is, and given its reframing by those sharing it, yes, absolutely, it can be seen that way, regardless of what the publisher intended. Now, is this drawing Islamophobic? No. I don't think this has anything at all to do with disliking Islam, but I understand why many have been led to believe that. Most people have seen this drawing from a Middle Eastern or Muslim source, with the connotations already spelled out for them, translated in their language. And since the magazine's international claim to fame is cartoons of the Prophet of Islam, which is a big no-no, they're seen as anti-Islam and by extension, anti-Muslim. I think the concept of Islamophobia is too complex to delve into in this video, but I'll break it down into two distinctive categories: fear or dislike of Islam and fear or dislike of Muslims. I don't think this drawing qualifies for either. I think that the magazine is anti-religion in general because of religion's political influence, but there are reasons why they're seen as antagonistic to Islam specifically. Perhaps they do single out Islam more often than other religions as a reaction to being attacked by Islamic terrorists, but I think that there's more to it than that. In my opinion, the biggest reason that it seems like Islam is Charlie Hebdo's favorite target is the statistical bias, not in their satirization of Islam, but in the chances of you hearing about it. We don't see the magazine making international headlines as often or as prominently when they draw a pope, for example, or when they make a distasteful drawing in the wake of a plane crash. But when Muslims get offended, they tend to be a lot more vocal about it than, say, Russians who were offended by this drawing. And unfortunately, given the terrorist attack in the very near past that followed someone being offended by a drawing, a lot of people are on edge and expecting that kind of thing to happen again, so it makes headlines. Outrage and fear are great ways to sell the news, unfortunately, and the media has figured that out, and it works. Besides, when Muslims take offense to a drawing made by Charlie Hebdo, they tend to disperse that to an international audience of believers from all backgrounds. The way that Muslims identify religiously tends to be lumped with a nationalist identity to form a conglomerate Muslim oneness. So a joke made at the expense of the Prophet is the same as a joke made at the expense of Muslims or Turks or Syrians and vice versa. And this whole interconnected network of related identities means that the Streisand effect is extremely strong there. Also, since most Muslims live in countries that don't allow for any satirization of their religion, it's extremely foreign and shocking to them to see it happen openly somewhere else, so the news travels further. And in this case, the drawing had nothing to do with Islam, but it's seen as indicative of hatred of Turks or Kurds, meaning Muslims, meaning that millions of people feel personally victimized by it. Another reason why this kind of drawing makes it very far in the news is that it slots perfectly into pre-existing channels in public discourse. To many, it's already been established that the secularist nations hate Muslims and are happy to kill as many of them as they can. So this kind of confirmation does very well in that climate. And the reality is that there are millions of people who suffered and are suffering because of wars that Western countries have either participated in or initiated. To go from experiencing that to believing that the general public in non-Muslim countries also hate you and mocks you in their media is not a far stretch. To be clear, I'm not saying that Charlie Hebdo are assholes to everyone, so that makes it okay. I'm saying that it's important to make the distinction between an edgy, offensive magazine getting off on shock value and a propaganda machine that advocates for ethnic genocide. Charlie Hebdo is one of those two, as far as I can tell. If we let this false narrative disperse that the French are openly celebrating the death of Muslims, it highly increases the chances of vigilante retaliation. It makes it much easier for a terrorist to morally justify to himself retaliation against the general public, thinking, if these genocidal people would do it to my people, why shouldn't I do it to theirs? And it further polarizes the Muslim versus non-Muslim culture war that so many politicians and preachers gain to benefit from. There is no shortage of politicians who will sway people to vote their way because of fear of the other. And there's no shortage of da'wah men in the West who capitalize on Muslims' feelings of otherness and alienate them even further so that they can have an easy-to-mobilize support base. They sometimes make threats even when they're offended, then they cry wolf when people are afraid. And I feel bad for all the people caught in between, all the Muslims caught in between these narratives. The point is, I urge you to think about who stands to benefit from the polarization and flashy headlines and to not let them get away with it. Focus on the people. Is Charlie Hebdo anti-Islam? This magazine is known for its anti-religious views, but it doesn't seem like they stem from a theological disagreement about God, but more about how religion plays into politics and everyday life. They're known for blaspheming against any religion as long as it's relevant to the point that they're making. I wouldn't characterize it as an anti-Islam magazine as much as it's anti-religious establishments. But I don't see anything wrong with them being anti-Islam just as much as I don't see anything wrong with them being anti-Christianity. People don't have to love and revere a set of ideas just because they're wrapped in a holy veneer and adopted by many. And because Muslims' identities tend to be deeply rooted in Islam, they tend to view any criticism or satirization or mockery of Islam or its symbols like Muhammad as a sign of hatred of them, which is not the case. If you look at my channel, it's clear that I critique and satirize Islam, but I don't hate Muslims. I often have productive conversations with them, and many from both sides of the aisle, so to speak, seem to find a safe space on my live streams. But if the two choices are pro or anti, one could easily classify me as anti-Islam, even though I'd add some qualifiers to that. But I'm clearly not anti-Muslim. The problem with the Islamophobia label is that it conflates the two. So whether we label Charlie Hebdo as Islamophobic or not isn't the productive distinction here, in my opinion. Slapping an Islamophobia label on any form of discourse tends to shut it down, which means that there won't be any room for discourse about Islam unless it's praise. So allow me to rephrase that. Is the magazine anti-Islam or is it anti-Muslim? That's a better question. I don't condemn them for drawing the Prophet. And I don't like that it's being equated to an insensitive joke about victims of natural disasters, or even worse, a joke about genocide if you interpret it that way. I think it's unwise to refrain from criticizing Muhammad out of fear of offending people or fear of retaliation. I think that since Muhammad is a public figure that is claimed to have done no wrong, it's irresponsible to not challenge that claim, because people can and do fall into harm while following in his footsteps, thinking that they're not doing anything wrong. But their drawing of the Prophet is an entirely separate matter from this drawing. This drawing is a rushed attempt to make some obscure, conceited point about war and politics that is devoid of empathy and humanity. It's utilizing these deaths to make a point without regards to the feelings of people who are the subject of the joke, yet they don't stand to gain anything from getting the point of the joke. It's not even remotely similar to blaspheming with the intent of challenging boundaries about the holiness of a long-dead moral idol. This is irresponsible, adding fuel to the fire and publishing something that could easily be interpreted as hate speech, contributing to the ongoing divide between all of the groups of people who see themselves targeted. This is prime radicalization and terrorist recruitment material. This is completely inconsiderate and useless and blasphemy against the sacredness of empathy and humanity. And I try to be consistent in my views, so please forgive me for my blind spots where they exist. But I think that I do maintain that consistency here because I'm not opposed to this drawing existence on grounds of it being blasphemous to my values. I can dislike it for that reason, but that's not why I hope they'd never publish it at all. I'm opposed to it because it causes more harm than it does benefit. Whatever they hoped the audience would gain from this joke does not outweigh its contribution to the distress that it causes the victims and the degradation of public discourse. I oppose it because, unlike blasphemous drawings of the Prophet, there is no comfort zone that people gain to benefit from expanding. The world would arguably be a better place if people didn't rage at the sight of a Prophet cartoon, but the world would be an uglier place if people laughed at tragedy that is used as cannon fodder to make their self-righteous commentary about how war is bad, or whatever else the artist intended to say. And lastly, I despise how this magazine was handed the baton of free speech and hailed as the biggest and most important user of that privilege. And now that they've shit the bed, they'll serve as a poster child of free speech and why it's a slippery slope to the death of humanity. But is that true? This topic could be its own video, and I'm tempted to gloss over it and leave it to someone more qualified than myself. but since it's very relevant, I feel like I have to give it a shot. It's all well and good to congratulate Charlie Hebdo for trying to find the limits of free speech, as paradoxical as that sounds. But we should also reprimand them when they find the threshold of productive free speech and cross into unproductive or even hateful territory. In this case, whether or not it's classified as hate speech is a very gray area, in my opinion, because it depends entirely on the interpretation. As far as I'm aware, this didn't garner any support in its hateful interpretation, so it wasn't intended nor received as hate speech that celebrated the demise of the Turks or the Kurds. Those in the know would not understand it that way. But the publisher did not just publish it to those in the know, and they cannot limit their audience to just those people. Millions have perceived it as an attack against them and believe that if you don't call for this to be censored, then you agree. Then you think it's good that people died without wasting taxpayer money. But that's not true. I don't think that this image should be censored, and I simultaneously despise it. I think we should use our free speech to speak louder than them. It's an opportunity to demonstrate en masse that we disagree with their method and with the hateful interpretation of this drawing. It's an opportunity to show the fearmongers that they're wrong. In fact, it's an opportunity to exercise your right to free speech, like the artist who drew this to give them a taste of their own medicine. We need to stop raising Charlie Hebdo to the standards of respectability and relevance that their detractors assume that they have. We need to let them fade into obscurity and marinate in shame when people from all walks of life ignore them for being too edgy for their own good. We need to add more nuance to our positions and stop taking sides based on who's closer to being on our team, so to speak. I won't automatically side with a free speech, irreligious publication just because their detractor is religious, and I will do my best to not fall for identity politics and calls for hasty mobilization against some group or another. I fear that censoring such a drawing from the internet robs us of the chance to publicly correct those who might find it funny that people from another group had died. Had it been a clear and cut reveling in tragedy which encouraged hatred, there would be a more compelling case for censorship. But because this is such a mixed bag, in my humble opinion, it's better to deal with it publicly, as a learning opportunity, as a chance to demonstrate to anyone who would have laughed at it why they're wrong and why they're in the minority, and as a chance to reassure those who feel victimized by this that we don't tolerate this rhetoric. As a side note regarding censorship, remember when I said whether or not this is classified as hate speech, in my opinion, is a very gray area because it depends entirely on interpretation? I think that applies to the Quran as well. If one could make the case that this should be banned, despite the intention presumably not being hateful and the reception being unilateral condemnation, then that makes a case for banning the Quran as hate speech. It's not only easy to hypothetically interpret as hateful towards many classes of people, it's actually a reality. People do use its verses as moral justification for hatred of disbelievers and dishing out punishment on behalf of God. You could argue that these verses that say kill the disbelievers and beat your wife and we will laugh at their torture are all somehow misunderstood, even though they're written by the most perfectly capable communicator. But if misunderstanding the Quran makes it immune to being classified as hate speech, shouldn't the same apply to this drawing? Just some food for thought. To reiterate, this video is not a plea that you give the artist a pass because they had some deeper point to make. It's a plea that you pay less attention to taking sides and take a moment before reacting. You can find this drawing repulsive and offensive without believing that it's indicative of a general tolerance for genocide or war. You can dislike it for being tone deaf, for missing the mark, for inadvertently fueling divisive rhetoric, but please do not leave with the conclusion that non-Muslims are celebrating your deaths. I don't care about taking sides. I care about people. People who felt dehumanized, and people who are portrayed as happy-go-lucky warmongers, and everyone else caught in the crossfire. And more importantly, the victims of the earthquakes. Since this topic stirred up a lot of commotion, let's direct this attention to those who need it the most, the victims. Please click the link in the description to find a way that you can contribute positively to helping those in need. Donating has a more direct and meaningful impact, much more than having an opinion on this drawing would have. I hope that today's video serves as insight into the mind of one ex-Muslim to demonstrate that there's more to our opinions than just siding with whoever is less religious. I think that humanity and empathy matter more than both religion and edgy satire. And I hope that this reassures people that they're not being dehumanized. And as always, think critically and think for yourself. P.S. Whoever drew this and whoever greenlit it at Charlie Hebdo, you either suck at your jobs or you're opportunistic trolls. Either way, you.